Hi everyone. With this particular video, something occurred to me as I was watching Alien Covenant, in that the film is largely symbolic in nature. However, in regards to analyzing it versus other films in the same franchise, I don't think they're that far apart from one another. The tone of the movies is different, but the symbolism contained within each, especially some of the earlier films, is largely intact. That is what makes them such rich films to analyze, I think, especially Alien, Aliens, Alien 3. Alien 3 isn't my favorite film in the franchise by any stretch of the imagination, but it is very religious, and religious films are largely symbolic in nature. Reading the Bible, of course, you can interpret it literally, of course, but generally I think you're going to glean a lot more from it if you analyze it metaphorically. If you don't take things literally and you don't actually believe that Methuselah lived to be so many centuries old, or that Jesus came back from the dead, things of this nature, they're symbolic, they're poetic, they're fantastical. They're not meant to be assumed as though having transpired literally in the way that they are on paper. And of course, you also have to keep in mind that there are various interpretations of the Bible too, translations. Translating is in and of itself a duplicitous act where you can go for literal sort of translation accuracy, translating word for word, or you can take poetic license, in which case it will actually read better in the language that you're translating it to. Sometimes translating it word for word doesn't work. There isn't a exact translation, or certain words don't translate. In linguistics, I studied just the mechanics of language, okay? And English, for instance, is not like German. German, for instance, the syntax is different. In English, you have subject, verb, object, and in German, I believe it's verb, object, subject. Regardless, it's different. I can't remember exactly what it is. It's also an agglutinative language that attaches meaning to words by literally adding or subtracting morphemes, affixes, suffixes, or prefixes, or infixes to words to kind of glue them together. So in German, you have these really, really long words. In English, you don't have this. They're mechanically speaking, syntactically, but also morphologically, they're just fundamentally different in that respect. So you can't translate them in a symmetrical manner, an entirely symmetrical manner. And the same idea works with the Bible, and biblical symbolism varies depending on the translation, but symbolism in and of itself varies from individual to individual, observing it, doing the translating, if you will, in that one person who watches Alien is going to have a completely different reaction from someone else. Say nothing in regards to what languages they speak, but if you had a Frenchman watch Alien and then you had a Scottish grandmother watch the same film, you would probably get a very different response. But by and large, just symbolically speaking, religiously speaking, something like Alien 3, it's a very religious film, which means that it's full of symbolism. Alien is a very symbolic film as well. And when I hear people, the reason I'm talking about all of this is I hear people, or I've heard people, when Alien Covenant initially came out, and they said that the film was bad, and that there wasn't really a lot there worth considering. For instance, Red Letter Media, the owners of that channel said that if you go into this movie expecting the same old xenomorph experience that you've gotten in the past, there isn't really a lot to look for, or it doesn't really offer that. And I'd have to agree, by and large, Alien Covenant doesn't really have that type of experience. It's sort of tacked on at the end. You have that fourth ending that Scott had for Alien, where essentially you had the 3 acts, and then there was a 4th act at the end with Ripley on board the Narcissus, and he had to convince the studio to shoot that in 5 days and add something extra onto the budget, and it was done very quickly, but it was something that Ridley had to fight for. But it was essentially an extra ending in that film. The original ending, of course, was Ripley simply making her escape. And this, of course, is a tradition that's carried on from film to film in the franchise, from Aliens to Alien Resurrection to Alien Covenant. And Alien Covenant almost does it twice, of course, because they have the fight when they're escaping the planet, but they also have the fight while they're orbiting the planet. And by and large, I hear a lot of people complaining, though, because in regards to Alien versus Alien Covenant, there are a lot of similarities between the films in regards to their plot, but some of the lesser entries, again, the symbolic sort of makeup that I'm orbiting here as I'm having this sort of rant, is by and large what keeps people coming back. It's essentially artistic appreciation. It's something that's different per individual, and yet each film has its own kind of theme. Alien had its own kinds of themes, right? Because you had Gothic horror. The female protagonist or the female character wandering alone in a Gothic castle was not something new when Ridley Scott did that film. This was something that Gothic authors, especially like Victorian Gothic or the Romantic Gothic from the British Romantic period, something like that, novelists had been writing about that for hundreds of years up to this point, a couple hundred years, give or take. And it wasn't a new idea, but that was by and large a lot of the symbolism came from Gothic horror or the horror of H.P. Lovecraft. Dan O'Bannon was largely inspired by that late Gothic author, so he would be early 20th century Gothic, H.P. Lovecraft. And by and large, you have this exploration of this ruin that brings about this horror that they wake up, and it really isn't that different. Just in regards to, if you take the two side by side, there are enough similarities that it's beyond coincidence. They work off of each other, and that kind of symbolism was what that film was about. You had Freudian sexuality and birth trauma. A lot of people attribute that to Freud, and he had his own version of that, but there were other people as well. Otto Rank, for instance, a pupil of Freud, who had his own sort of interpretation of the idea of birth trauma. Birth trauma could be argued as the physically traumatic experience of being born. Otto Rank argued that it was actually the traumatic experience of being separated from one's mother, which you could say is actually something that's a little bit more prevalent in some of the latter versions of or the following sequels to Aliens, such as Aliens, where you have Ripley, who is separated from her child. So the idea that birth trauma is traumatic for the mother and the offspring in that particular instance. And Amanda Ripley McLaren is killed off due to old age, essentially, before Ripley can make it back home. She's out drifting through outer space, only to be discovered by a deep salvage team 57 years after the fact, and she's separated from her child, and that's a traumatic experience for her. That, in a certain kind of way, of course, birth trauma is quite literally at birth, but you can take it symbolically too. You know, it doesn't just have to be. It can be a symbolic womb or a metaphorical womb, and then you have Ripley and Newt. And there's a certain kind of birth trauma there, where she is the surrogate mother of Newt, the Madonna, the Immaculate Conception, and then she's separated from her at towards the end of the film. It's very traumatic for her. You can see that in the performance of the character, and she has to reunite with this child in order to sort of restore that bond or that link that was severed at the very beginning and then towards the end of the film. She works very hard to sort of maintain that, to overcome this trauma. The alien wasn't just attacking her and her crew, it was attacking her bond that she had with her child. And so these kinds of things run throughout the entire series, but every film is, again, symbolically its own sort of monster. And again, Alien was very much a Gothic film. Gothic castle, the Gothic heroine, the final girl, or the last woman standing, that kind of thing. And it has its own kind of feel. There's a Hitchcockian sort of flavor to it, where you're just waiting for things to happen. It's a haunted house picture. And then James Cameron sort of plays off this. There's a lot of parallels to it and the parent film. So Aliens basically riffs off of Aliens, but it feels like his own picture at the same time. So you have a sequence underneath the atmospheric processor, for instance, that is by and large cosmetically different. And yet at the same time, there is an undercurrent or a theme that's sort of repeating itself. Cosmetically, it's different. Aesthetically, superficially, it's different. But underneath the surface, there's this sort of mythic structure that just sort of repeats itself. And you could also call it plot devices or tropes, however you want to sort of package it or label it. There's something being repeated, and then there's a unique sort of spin on things. So it's not just carbon copies, or what they call a spitting image. Originally, spitting image meant that someone looked as though you had spat them out, and they looked exactly like you for whatever reason. But that's what that idiom sort of means. And yet, in this case, of course, they were paying homage to those that came before, but they were, again, James Cameron put his own spin on it. David Fincher tried to put his own spin on it. The studio interfered, and then Ridley Scott returned, and a lot of people had problems with Alien Covenant, for instance, or Prometheus that came before it. But by and large, what makes those films interesting, and why I think people continue to watch and appreciate Prometheus, and why I think they will continue to watch and appreciate Alien Covenant, is that those are very symbolically rich films. Say what you want about David Lindelof, he provided a lot of symbolism to the screenplay of that film, and I think if he had any particular forte worth mentioning, it would be his ability to sort of riff off of symbolic material. And the screenwriters for Alien Covenant were very much the same, where you have a lot of symbolic content in regards to the symbol of the Valkyrie, which David represents, the symbol of Prometheus and the gods, and that Promethean quest, which actually kind of runs throughout the entire franchise, at least the more symbolically heavy entries, which again are the most classic. Those are the ones that people keep coming back to, because if you remove the symbolic elements and you just have the rote sort of mechanical tropes where they land on a planet, something goes wrong, and people die, and then they fly away, and they think that everything's fine, someone gives birth. These kinds of things are essentially the skeleton, but the symbolism is what puts meat on the bones, and that's what keeps people coming back. And when I hear people say that Alien Covenant is pretentious, there's nothing there, it's simply a symbolic, heavy film, and the symbolism is perhaps slightly outdated with today's culture. You have a lot of classical allegory going on here, classical allusions to Milton, Byron, Dante, Blake, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley. These are authors that were alive, say, 200 odd years ago, and give or take, maybe, depending on which. Those authors are all from the Romantic period, but they're from different generations. For instance, Blake was from the first generation of British Romantic poets or writers, and then the likes of Byron and the Shelley couple, they were second generation Romantic poets, writers, novelists, what have you. By and large, though, I don't think that type of symbolism is something that a lot of people are going to be familiar with in today's day and age. Yes, you have Frankenstein the film with Boris Karloff, for instance, but it is radically different than Mary Shelley's book. If it's a lot different than, say, Lord of the Rings by Peter Jackson or Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Those are they have a lot of tiny differences, but they're fairly similar in a lot of respects. Where if you took Frankenstein, any of the cinematic versions of that, and you compare them to the book, they're even more far removed. So people's understanding of Mary Shelley's work is through things that don't really have a lot in common with the novel that she actually wrote. So when people see a film by Ridley Scott that is taking a lot of the themes of these romantic authors that people are kind of familiar through these radical adaptations that are far removed from the source material, people are going to be left feeling kind of confused. But for them to say that they're pretentious and that there's not really a lot there, I would argue that they're very symbolically rich in the visuals. If you watch a lot of the things unfolding on screen, the imagery is symbolic in nature. Again, in Alien Covenant, when David has the flare, let there be light, the idea where he's quoting Milton, and the conversations that he has between Wayland and Walter, where you have these two diametrically opposed individuals that serve as foils for one another to create a contrast that enriches the conversation, which is different depending on who's talking. So if it's Wayland and David, or Walter and David, and it's different, and the characters are different, but it's good stuff. It's rich stuff, and it's the type of stuff that would have been discussed by the Shelleys or Byron or Blake, any of those guys symbolically, and it's not necessarily spelled out. For instance, if you see some of this symbolic imagery, essentially you have to be able to interpret it as an audience, which requires a certain amount of familiarity with what's being discussed symbolically by Scott, which isn't necessarily something that's going to happen if the audience isn't entirely familiar with it directly, if they haven't read the novel, or if they haven't read the poetry of Byron, which in the film would have actually helped understand certain plot elements in regards to how David is constantly citing the wrong author for the wrong poem. Ozymandias was written by Percy Bysshe Shelley, not Lord Byron. They were both poets, of course, but it's a mistake, and this is something that Walter points out in regards to David's madness. So that's a very literal example where familiarity with the subject material directly at an academic or classical level would help you actually appreciate what's being discussed. But there's plenty of room for symbolic imagery, just like the religious imagery in Alien 3, the idea of death and rebirth through a religious angle told by the pastor or the preacher on the prison colony. It has its own kind of religious slant, but it's very symbolic. And you have the Ripley falling into the fire in a Jesus Christ pose. That's symbolic imagery. It's artistic expression. It's not necessarily something that would happen in a way that would just sort of transpire in day-to-day events. It's staged. It's tableau in the Shakespearean sense. We have these characters that are sort of striking these frozen poses that have symbolic meaning that sort of persists. And then, of course, you have ringside, or you have the non-tableau portion of the stage where the play is actually going on, and it's radically different. And in Aliens by James Cameron, the symbolism in that particular film is very much about war. You have a commentary on the Vietnam War era, and it was very much about that in regards to you have the American soldiers who are gung-ho and cocky, and they go into this situation and essentially get their asses handed to them by the natives. The indigenous population of Vietnam could very much be replaced symbolically or represented symbolically by the xenomorphs, and this was something that is discussed in a very candid manner by the filmmakers. It was very much an allegory that they wanted to make. It's a allegory of the Vietnam War era told a decade later in 1986 through a scientific aesthetic. And so there's symbolism there. But you can interpret it a lot of different ways. You could say that it was also based off of Starship Troopers, which all of the actors had to read, which was motivated or built on its own constellation of ideas by that author. Robert Heinlein, I think. And so you can't always just assume that there's one way to interpret things either. Back to what I was saying about language, or it's just as much on the reader as it is what's being presented in these situations. But they're very symbolically rich. People like Prometheus because it's a space adventure film with a lot of symbolism. I would say that it has certain flaws, but the flaws that it has aren't really that different from the flaws in, say, Alien Covenant. In those two particular films, I would say that they both suffer from editing issues. They're a little bit too quick. Alien gets that much more right in regards to its pacing, but this doesn't have anything to do with symbolism, okay? And when people say that Alien Covenant doesn't have that much to offer, or it's stupid, or things like this, it's like, no, it's a very symbolically heavy film. And there's a lot there to appreciate, but I am, of course, a classical scholar who appreciates things like Milton or the Romantic poets, be it Mary Shelley or Percy Bysshe Shelley or John Keats or Wordsworth or Samuel Taylor Coleridge or William Blake or Lord Byron. Any of them. I like their poetry. It really resonates with me. And it just kind of depends, because you can have a poet like E. Cummings, who's canonical, that I don't really like all that much, or I'm not a huge fan of Walt Whitman and the idea of free verse. Or you have Milton, who wrote in blank verse, and you have poetry today that doesn't have any structure. It's more like Whitman's idea of poetry. You have Robert Frost. I always enjoyed Robert Frost, or Shakespeare, or Petrarch. But in particular, I always really responded to the British Romantics. So when I go in and watch this movie, I can really understand that. Not only do I just resonate with me sort of natively or naturally, but it's my area of expertise, academically speaking. This is what I'm studying. So it's a two-part process. One, I just appreciate it on a natural level. I respond to it. And I think that everyone's like that. Anyone who reads is going to have a particular type of genre or style that they gravitate towards. But this would help explain why I like Alien Covenant. And when people say something is pretentious, this isn't a comment purely on the object in and of itself, okay? Because it is a piece of art, and art by itself is just an object. In order for it to be ascribed meaning, this has to be done through the eyes of whoever is observing it. And this meaning is going to exist or not exist depending on who's observing it. So someone like me, who really digs the kind of stuff that Scott is commenting on here, the thematic elements, the symbolic imagery, because it's not a science fiction film, and none of the films are. There's a scientific aesthetic that sort of lends this pseudo scientific feel, but it's not, okay? In Alien, the Nostromo was again a castle floating through outer space. In Aliens, it was a gun. In other films in the series, it's not quite as in your face symbolically, but you have these large, slow-moving spaceships. It's not faster than light travel. They never actually explain any of that. Not to say that Star Trek or something like that offers explanations. Those are false science, or they're bits of science mixed with bits of pseudoscience jargon. It's not actually real. Okay, it's not that kind of hard science. Okay, Star Trek, the original Star Trek, there are certain things that, yeah, you could say that you have characters like Spock who are largely reasonable. But you have characters like Kirk who are not, and you have their ships are powered by essentially magic. Okay, it's the magic portal trope in regards to time travel or wormholes or folding space in Dune, anything like that. In Alien, it's the same idea. It's fantasy. It's a movie, and if it's fantasy, if it's not following the rules of science, it's all about artistic expression, which is why you have these really absurd kinds of spaceships in those films, or absurd behaviors, or characters that ignore rules. That's part of the drama. There would be no drama in a situation where you had scientific protocol where everything was being followed and nothing went wrong. But if you have characters that ignore it due to hubris, Daedalus and his son Icarus. Daedalus says to his son, don't fly too close to the sun. You could say that's scientific protocol, right? It'll melt the wax that bind the feathers of his wings together. When the wax melts, his wings fall apart and he plummets into the sea and dies. And it's the same kind of idea metaphorically. And that would be a classical illusion right there, that Promethean quest, or that Icarian sort of folly, where you have Icarus flying too close to the sun. You have Cain sticking his face into the egg. These kinds of things are very much things that are explored throughout the series, but each one is different. And when someone comes along and says, look, from the aficionados who just appreciate the base writing tropes, where you want the xenomorph, you want that kind of action, sure, according to Red Letter Media that I mentioned earlier, there isn't really a lot there to just recommend to your average sort of pulse rifle hungry fan, someone who just wants the check boxes, if you will. But in regards to the symbolism, it's just as rich as the classics, okay? Again, the goth, Freudian, sort of heavy allegories of the first film, the Lovecraftian elements, then you have the war allegories, the Vietnam War era, and the ideas of Otto Rank's birth trauma in the second film, the Madonna, Immaculate Conception, and then you have the religious elements that are being explored constantly in the third film. Those films are all symbolically heavy, and they're symbolically rich, and there are plenty of instances where, again, the idea of the tableau, or the frozen or slow-moving image in the background, and you have this ridiculous sort of monster in the first film that is slow-moving, and it's largely symbolic, and it's a walking phallic symbol. It's a walking symbol of rape or violation. And it's also a walking art piece because it's based off Geiger's own artwork. It's his art brought to life. So yes, that film is very symbolic. It's very tableau. And Aliens is the same way. Alien 3. But Prometheus and Covenant, say what you will about the plot or the continuity, because like it or not, these films don't really... There are differences. There are things that don't necessarily fit together evenly between films. In the first film, the creature is different than it is in the second film and the third film. Not just cosmetically, but the way that it functions. Alien Resurrection. Prometheus, you don't even really have anything. You just have these echoes, or you see it on a mural. And then in Alien Covenant, you have a creature that seems like it's a return to the alien sort of monster that Geiger had, but even then it's still different. Its behavior is different. Its inception is different. Its genesis is told in a much more biblical or romantic manner. There's this interesting sort of amalgam of Norse mythology and Egyptian mythology, which existed in the first film, not the second film. But the first film, Ridley was very interested in that. There's a lot of Easter eggs and visual parallels to Alien, but also sort of building on that. And it has its own sort of symbolic images and things that go beyond the scope of what Alien was interested in doing. Alien had its own things that it wished to address. Alien Covenant has its own thematic sort of palette that it expands upon in ways that Alien never even tried. And for people to call it pretentious, going back to the idea of what the viewer brings or what the viewer sees, if I was to read, say, I don't know, Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and I knew absolutely nothing about the author, the history of the poem, the symbolism, the type of structure that he's using. Is it iambic pentameter, the verse, the meter, so on and so forth, then I could say it's pretentious, but I also might not be qualified to actually make any type of conclusive statement in regards to what the poem is about. But if you take a little time to study something, then your opinion of it will automatically change. There's a danger in prescribing do's or don'ts based on first reactions or impressions. It's essentially a gut response. But my opinion of Alien Covenant has changed quite a bit since the first time I saw it, or even before it came out and I was just watching the marketing material. What I had in my head then versus when I first saw it, versus how I felt about it when I started watching it at home, versus how I feel about it now. Those are all sort of contained historically. Each moment is different. And for people to say, "Oh, well, this is pretentious," that's just an overused buzzword where people say that it's essentially void of any real content. You could say the same thing of symbols, because again, the way the symbols work is in and of themselves they are completely meaningless. And meaning comes through the people assigning them. And you also have to keep in mind that if we're not assigning them directly, we're observing symbols and then ascribing meaning to them. It's the same idea. Either they're provided for us or it's Scott providing them to an audience, us. But regardless, to call something pretentious is essentially a description of an interaction between symbols and the person observing those symbols. So according to them, there's nothing there. But according to me, there is. And it really just depends. And I'm curious to see how the film does in the following years to come, because when Prometheus came out and people were very much polarized by that film, it was very, very much a mixed response. And by and large, I think Alien Covenant, in regards to, say, professional critics, was fairly similar to Prometheus. There were some people that absolutely didn't like it, but there were some people that absolutely enjoyed it. Roger Ebert, or his website, in both instances, really enjoyed the film. A top-level critic. Of course, the review for Alien Covenant was written by someone who is employed by his website, so it's not quite the same thing. But given its content and given how similar it is in certain respects to Prometheus, I imagine that Roger Ebert probably would have responded in a similar manner, and the person that is doing writing for his site was probably selected by him before his death to continue on maintaining the site, or by someone that he knew. It's not like it's just some random person. It's someone that probably thinks to a similar degree, if not identically, to Roger Ebert. And you have certain critics who really enjoy the film, and you have certain critics who don't. And I think that this isn't really that different from any film in the series, because you have certain people that love Alien. You have certain people that love aliens. James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, did a review of Alien Covenant where he said, you know, it's sort of up there. It's a little bit higher than some of the other films, but it's not in the same sort of ballpark as the first two. Those will always be the best. But it just doesn't work like that, because a friend of mine, for instance, watched Alien Covenant and loved it. Just comparing it to, say, Aliens, and she's younger. She's in her early 20s, but she saw the film, and her reaction was radically different than James Rolfe's. But she loves science fiction. She's also British, though. Okay, whereas James Rolfe is American. But she loves a lot of those themes. She loves David as a character, and there's a certain sort of attraction that she has to his character that maybe makes her biased. But that's the point that I'm trying to make here, is that we're all biased in our own way, and we're going to interpret these things differently. So when James Rolfe says, you know, these two are the highest, that's his opinion, according to his view, according to his biases. He's going to view these things in such a way that he says they will always be this high. The fallacy with that statement is that they won't be, that they will change over time. There was another critic, Chris Stuckman, who did a review of Alien 3, where he paired up with a different critic who was the expert on that film. And initially he disliked it, but then watching the film over time, he actually came to like it more than any other film in the series. And in regards to me, I love Alien, okay, because I'm gothic horror all the way. Yeah, I'm just a huge fan of it. I grew up with that movie. I first saw it when I was 9. I watched it almost religiously throughout my teen years and throughout high school and early college, and I still watch it every once in a while. I have it practically memorized. Even to this day, I can just watch the movie. I know exactly what's going to happen, just like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. And with Alien Covenant, it's a similar type of thing. Whereas the more I study the film, the more I like it. And of course, with Alien, it reminds me of something that Bruce Lee said in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, where he says, "When I first learned to punch, it was just a punch. When I began to study it, it became more than just a punch. When I had mastered it, it was just a punch." So the idea is it changes over time. You think that you know things, false knowledge. Then you go into a situation and you begin to sort of begin the intimate process of study and retrospection of things that you initially thought were just nothing. You realize there's something there, but then by the end of it, you kind of come across a similar conclusion that you had initially, where it's no longer new, it's no longer exciting, you have mastery over it, and that's the difference. And I've watched Alien so many times that that virgin experience has kind of subdued for me, but I can of course I can appreciate the film. It always makes me laugh. There are certain moments that always give me goosebumps, but that virgin experience of just watching it and feeling the thrill, that's gone. And it's been replaced by a mastery or just an intimate understanding of that film that really will never go away, at least not over a short period of time. I imagine if I never talked about or saw the film again, perhaps it would begin to fade, but it lives within me. I'm a huge fan of the series, of the franchise. And with Alien Covenant, it's the same kind of idea, where I'm watching this film and I'm observing changes within me in regards to how I feel about it. And by and large, they were positive initially, but they've kind of remained positive. And people might say, detractors would say, well, you're just biased, and you'll always like the film, and you have your heart set on it, and you're deceiving yourself to its flaws. It's like, no, I realize that there are certain impurities, if you want to call it that, but you also have to make comparisons to something based on what it is, not what you want it to be. So I could make the comparison between it and Alien and say that it's not as good as Alien, but they're two different kinds of films, despite the fact that they have a symbolic parallel in that they're very symbolic heavy films. But one is Gothic horror. Alien Covenant is not Gothic horror. It's full of classical illusions, and it has a symbolic sort of or sci-fi aesthetic to it, but it's different. It's made by Ridley Scott, 40 years older than he was in 1979. It has different people working on it. It has different writers, different artists. It's a much larger team. It's made by a man who has mastered his craft. It's not the trial by fire that resulted in this freak accident kind of classic. And in a certain way, you could say that gives it sort of a workman-like quality, or journeyman sort of quality, where it doesn't have that magical accident feel to it. But at the same time, it's still made by the same guy, and there are still certain parallels or similarities. It's kind of exploring the same things differently. It has the same elements, but they're being interpreted creatively differently by the same artistic entrepreneur, Ridley Scott. He is talking about the same things in ways that he didn't in Alien, and yet there are parallels. There are symmetrical qualities. And there's a similar level of richness. So when I hear people say, the movie is stupid, I think what they're commenting on is that it's not their cup of tea. They don't like the direction that it's going in, or they don't like the fourth ending, for instance, that sort of alludes to the xenomorphs that Scott admittedly sort of pigeonholed or shoehorned into the film. Does that mean that I hate it? No, it doesn't, because there's a lot more going on than just that. If you focus on the xenomorph, it's like a finger pointing to the moon. Don't focus on the finger or you miss all that heavenly glory. And there's a lot more going on than just that the familiar phallic object that our eyes gravitate towards, or the flute scene in Alien Covenant, where if you focus on the sexual innuendos of that scene, which are fairly flimsy or timid at best, you're going to miss the actual content of the scene, and there's a lot of stuff. It's a continuation of the same discussion that begins in the opening bookend of the film, okay? But if you're focusing on, the flute's a dick, you're going to miss all of that. But that's the most interesting part of the film. But there's also a lot of interesting stuff going on, sort of a puzzle at the end of Alien Covenant. But if you're focused on the fact that, oh, it's Ridley Scott repeating himself, you're going to miss that. What's more interesting, and the idea of the drama, and people saying, oh, well, this is stupid, because we can kind of suspect that that's David. But that's precisely the point, according to Scott. There has to be drama. If you're not aware of it at all, then it doesn't exist theatrically. And there are so many questions raised by this. It's like, okay, what is he doing in this situation? If this is David, you look back at this retrospectively and you think to yourself, well, what? Okay, this was David. Well, why was he doing what he was doing? And this is interesting to me, but there's actually a reason for it. It's partially symbolic, but by and large, David is a very theatrical character. He's very much a vice character in the tradition of the vice characters of Shakespearean plays. You know, he's very bombastic. He's very loud. I saw a Shakespearean performance once. I believe it was Hamlet, done by one actor. But the interesting thing about the performance wasn't that he was able to convey it in a way that we might say is accurate of Shakespearean performance in the Elizabethan era, but rather that he was able to maintain our attention the entire time by being bombastic, by being overly theatrical. And I swear to God, anytime he did anything, our attention was just on him. It was interesting. It didn't have to make sense. In RoboCop, where you had the lead actor of that film, whose name, of course, is conveniently blanking on me at the moment, he worked with a famous pantomime performer who was able to provide classic examples of pantomime on screen. It was an early silent film that he had the actor for Murphy in RoboCop, which is also a symbolic film, I might add. He watched that, and the performance by the actor in the silent film was kind of bizarre. There were just these motions and things that didn't really make any sense logically, but they kept your attention on the character. Okay, but they didn't have to make any sense. That's the point of this. But they're able to sort of hold your attention. Alan Rickman in Die Hard is a great villain, and he's quite intelligent, but there's a lot of theatricality to his performance. Or Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, the pencil trick, certain things. Like, he's a crazy character. He doesn't really make any sense as a character, apart from the fact that he's a self-proclaimed agent of chaos. But it's entertaining. Anytime he's on screen, you just sort of perk up and you like it. One or two little nitpicks aside, that's a whole nother can of worms, but the idea is, in Alien Covenant, you have a character who's very bombastic, whose actions are crazy, nutty. He's an agent of chaos in the same sense, but he's not boring. But the nice thing about him as a character is that if you analyze the film symbolically, and it's not just him being insane. Now, there's a method to his madness, to quote Hamlet. And there's more to it than just meets the eye. It's not just a crazy android on this planet. If you analyze the film symbolically, that will make more sense. Just like a lot of the images in the film will make more sense in regards to the neutrino burst and this really impractical spaceship that isn't prepared to sort of traverse the stars in a way that you might actually think would work. It makes a lot more sense if you analyze it symbolically. It's a slow-moving vessel that is crippled during a storm. The captain dies. They send his body out to sea, and they have to make repairs, and they need to go ashore. They need to essentially get away from this dangerous, tempestuous sea, like the Tempest, right? This terrible storm essentially shipwrecks this craft, and the crew, technically, of course, the ship isn't scuttled. They are able to sort of leave the planet, but it's the same kind of idea. At the end of the Tempest, of course, everyone leaves the island. And it's the same kind of idea in Alien Covenant or Forbidden Planet, where you have these classical allegories. And it's a very rich film as far as that goes. And in regards to what I was saying earlier about these are the kinds of things that pop out at me the more I study the film. And I think once people get past the initial sort of, oh, this movie sucks sort of response, that's a first response. That's a gut response. And I think people speak loudly in that situation because they have a certain amount of faith that if they are loud enough, the squeaky wheel will get the grease. And Fox will sort of listen to them. They'll not turn a deaf ear to these consumers. It's putting faith into the capitalist system that we inhabit, where the consumer is given a certain amount of power, where if they complain loudly enough, they'll get what they want. Essentially taking away power from the director and putting it in the hands of the people that buy tickets. There's a certain amount of truth to this situation, but it doesn't mean that if they just dislike something, that there's nothing there. And the more that I study the film, I appreciate it more, and I notice these things. Again, this allegory to the Tempest, that Shakespearean way of sort of reading the film, as opposed to looking at it through Norse or Egyptian mythology, or the idea of the Promethean quest, the ancient Greek myth that was sort of extrapolated or built upon by Mary Shelley in her novel, The Modern Prometheus, aka Frankenstein, which has been regurgitated throughout the years. So if I can notice these things, maybe other people will too once they get past this initial sort of hate response that they had for the film. It's just a phase. It's people being mad at something. It takes energy to be angry at something and just to hate it constantly and to say it's a piece of shit. I even hear people defending Alien Resurrection and saying, you know, there are certain things about it that aren't that bad. And I guess technically that's true. But it's certainly a weaker entry in the franchise. There are certain things about it that just aren't likable. The execution, other things I could mention. But there are things that you will notice over time that you don't hate quite as much. And by and large, unless a movie, you can have a shine with a film. You take a shine to it early on, and that can fade. The honeymoon is over, and then you realize the reality of the situation, where you have the perfections versus the imperfections. Okay. But I think there's a balance. It's going to start high, and then it's going to kind of level out. It's going to start low. It's going to level out. Even something that's arguably, technically horrible, like The Room, is so bad that it actually is a lot better than you might think. So, again, it depends how you analyze this. But Alien Covenant is a thoroughly enjoyable film, and it's an intellectual film. It's something that I can engage with. In the same way that a lot of people defend Prometheus now, tooth and nail. It's the same kind of thing that gets explored in Alien Covenant. And I think that once, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot here, and I am, and I have a tendency to do that in these rant-like videos, but it's something it's a phenomena that's going to repeat itself, I think, with Alien Covenant. Whether or not another film will get made, I don't know. People just want an instant sort of response with this. Fox, care to comment on this? Are you going to make another film right away? People have to keep in mind, it took 5 years for Covenant to enter theaters after Prometheus. So this kind of thing just doesn't happen overnight. Alien was made in 1979. Aliens was made in 1986. And then Alien 3 was made in the early 90s. I want to say 91. Or maybe it was 93. Early 90s. And then you had Alien Resurrection was 1998, and then you had the AVP films. But there's a certain similarity between the windows of time per film. They're not made quickly. They're not like Marvel films. Because generally speaking, each film gets its own director. And the only instance in the entire franchise that I can think of where you have the same director making multiple films is with Ridley Scott. Okay, if you don't want to say, well, Alien to Prometheus, that doesn't count because there are films in between, you can say from Prometheus to Alien Covenant is the first example of a director who essentially was allowed to make more than one Alien film in tandem or in conjunction with one another. So you had one, then the other, and they were made by the same guy. And it still took 5 years for that to happen. And he made the film relatively quickly. The production period, he knew what he wanted to do. And he has these things kind of set up and he wants to do more of them. And of course people are fighting that, and Alien Covenant wasn't as successful as Prometheus was, but it was also about 2/3 as expensive, if I'm not mistaken. They didn't shoot it in 3D, and certain technologies have improved since the making of that film in regards to, say, 3D printing. And there's just a certain economic or fiscally sound procedure that Scott has begun to perfect. You know, from one to the next, he's able to do certain things that allow him to save money. And it still is a very solid looking film. So I'm beginning to sort of have conjecture here about, okay, when's a sequel going to happen? I don't know. But it could very easily be in 5 years. And of course, at that point, you know, Scott's going to be getting up there. But I've heard of directors who are older than him who are still making films, like Clint Eastwood, who's 86 now, 87. You know, he's pushing 90 and he's still making films. And Scott's, I know some people might say that he's not of sound mind, non-compos mentis, but he seems sound to me. You know, he's making the same kind of films he's always made. Alien was just as symbolic as Prometheus or Alien Covenant. And it feels a little bit different, of course, because you had a lot of other people contributing to it. We had a lot of people contributing to Alien Covenant as well, even if Scott was making some bigger calls than he did back in the day. Well, he's been in the business for 40 years. Okay, he's the master. He's the boss, the governor, however you want to put it. But it's not like he wasn't making decisions like that back in the day. And you have to keep in mind, certain decisions made by the studio aren't always beneficial. In Blade Runner, you had the voiceover, which, to be perfectly honest, was completely unnecessary. But then you had the idea where the studio would come in and cut certain scenes in Alien, or they had certain things that they would change from the original script. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So I'm really curious to see if enthusiasm for a sequel will change as people purchase the film. You know, the idea that how successful is Alien Covenant in DVD sales? You know, essentially home theater sales versus the box office. It's like, I don't know. I remember Prometheus was very successful as far as that goes, and it sold a lot of copies. And of course, they had a really fabulous making of featurette, the Furious Gods, which was like 4 hours long, and it was very in depth. And with Alien Covenant, they kind of skimped out as far as all that goes. And Scott has other pictures that he wants to make, but he makes a lot of movies. I mean, he's very busy. You know, he did Prometheus, he did The Counselor. What else did he work on? The Martian, and then he did Alien Covenant. You know, so he's busy, and I think he produced some TV shows as well. You know, so he's a very busy man, and a lot of people say it's like grief therapy. So I think that as long as he kind of keeps up that momentum and he stays interested with this, perseverance at the end of the day, and people's responses to the film over a longer period of time, because again, they don't rush this. They don't crank out movie year after year, or 6 months. You get a movie every 6 months, like the Marvel series. It's not like that, you know. So, but it's a very important franchise to Fox, and it's ultimately up to them, you know, because Scott wasn't approached for a sequel. Instead, they approached James Cameron and then Fincher. But when Fincher got involved, the studio had their own ideas, and he was a new director. Then you got Jean-Pierre Jeunet, the director of Amélie, that they approached for some reason, probably because of his visual talents. And sometimes foreign directors like to break out into the American cinemascape, and they try their hand at it, and it wasn't really that successful of an experiment for various reasons, which paradoxically are the reasons why Alien was successful. You had all these different talents coming together, but they worked in harmony, whereas with Alien Resurrection they didn't. And these are the same kinds of things that Scott has to deal with. You know, he's working with forces that are powerful. You know, Fox, this is a franchise that they really like, and it's ultimately their call. But it stands to reason that he has a certain amount of interest in it, and he cares a lot about it, and he has a lot of talent and sway in the industry more than, say, a lot of new directors. Someone like Blomkamp, for instance, was sort of was benched when Scott came forward and expressed interest, and now people are saying, well, I didn't make enough money. Well, the Alien franchise, even though, as far as I understand it, is Fox's most profitable franchise, the films in and of themselves don't make nearly as much money as, say, Avatar or Lord of the Rings or the Avengers. But it's also a fairly lengthy franchise. It's been around a long time, whereas Avatar only made one film, so there's no way to really say for sure. I would be interested to see if James Cameron is able to sort of catch lightning in the bottle, do a hat trick of that. But I don't know what's going to happen in the future. There's so many different things that could happen. Scott could die very easily. I mean, Tony Scott committed suicide out of the blue. Something similar could happen with Scott. He's an old man. He's pushing 80. People have health complications at that age. Roger Ebert, I don't even think was I think he died in his mid 60s, maybe early 70s. But he wasn't nearly as old as Scott, I don't think. But he had health complications, and he died as a result of those. So Scott could have these ideas that remain unfinished. Bach, when he was composing the Art of the Fugue, left it unfinished. It was this lifelong work that to this day remains incomplete because he died before he could finish it. Scott has this long sort of epic that he wants to tell, and he's not afraid to make movies in between that, because again, he did Prometheus, but then he went on to do The Counselor and The Martian, kind of experiment, try some different things out. But then he went back to do Alien Covenant, so he could very easily do a couple more films, and then he could go and return and do another Alien film, and then maybe have that be the bookend to his professional career. It started basically with Alien. I mean, there was The Duelist before that, and commercials, obviously, but Alien was kind of the big one. I mean, he got a lot of attention at Cannes, and he got a lot of critical acclaim for The Duelists. But I think his breakout film really was Alien. He could end his career with his modus operandi, or not modus operandi, magnum opus. His, like Beethoven when he wrote Beethoven's Ninth, his last symphony. Even though he was still composing Beethoven's 10th, a lot of people sort of attribute Brahms writing. I want to say it was one of his symphonies that they called Beethoven's 10th because they were so similar, and Brahms wanted to pay tribute to Beethoven. Very much in the same idea Cameron paid tribute to Scott in regards to symphonies. If Alien was Scott's second symphony, then Aliens could be argued as Scott's third. So I'm interested to see if Scott will have his own sort of magnum opus, and he'll be able to end his career. But he's been around a long time, and it's not like the franchise is going anywhere, and it's not like he's been banned, right? Because you have to keep in mind, Scott wasn't allowed to do Aliens. Someone else, despite the fact that the film was successful, they still didn't ask him to make a sequel. They still went to James Cameron, a relative newcomer, and have him make a film. They didn't have Geiger involved. People had a fit with Alien Covenant because they were exploring ideas that were sort of germane to Geiger's portfolio. Yeah, Geiger is dead at this point, but people had a huge fit about that, but they forget that in Aliens, Geiger wasn't involved with that. Stan Winston did the creature effects and everything like that. And Scott was ignored. They didn't come to him, and they might not for this next Alien film. They might actually go to Blomkamp. And to be perfectly 100% honest, I think Blomkamp is a little disillusioned right now, and he's off making these independently sort of produced featurettes with his own film company, and which is interesting because I just found a metal band. It was actually from the early days of the golden era of 80s thrash. It was Manila Road, and they were out of Wichita, Kansas. But they never released an album on a major label. They basically self-produced their own music, or they did it through alternate sort of channels. That's kind of what Blomkamp is doing. Okay, but these guys, Manila Road, did some really, really kick-ass albums. I mean, I'm listening to them right now for the first time, but they're really solid. There's a lot to recommend for them. And it's kind of funny because the singer sort of sounds like Bruce Dickinson on Book of Souls, which is funny because back in 1983 you had someone who sounds like what Bruce Dickinson would sound like essentially 30 years later after their golden era. And it's interesting though that you have Blomkamp, who's disillusioned and he's doing this sort of independently producing his own films or shorts. And he had Sigourney Weaver work with him on one of them, and I saw one. I think it was called Zygote, which I kind of liked. It had, I want to say, it had Dakota Fanning's younger sister, or maybe it was Dakota Fanning herself, as the starring role of that. But they're short, and they look good, but they're not feature length films. They're not on the silver screen. But Blomkamp has kind of moved away from that, and I don't really blame him, considering that his Alien project is dead in the water. But things could change. There's really no way to tell, because again, they might not approach Scott. They might just want to try someone else, because ultimately the franchise doesn't belong to Scott. It belongs to Fox. And they can decide, okay, can we try Scott again? Let's try someone else. But it's slow and steady wins the race. It's kind of how the Alien franchise works. Every director is different per entry except for Scott, who kind of, again, a trailblazer in certain respects, who was allowed to return for seconds, as it were, in regards to helming a film as director. But that could very easily change. They might want to try someone else. It's the same idea with the Batman films, right? Where they keep making movies over and over. They keep writing comics over and over. And you have different creative directors. Either, a comic book creative director of some type, or author or illustrator, what have you, versus Christopher Nolan versus Tim Burton. It's this kind of thing is going to repeat, folks, because these studios, despite the fact that, copyright law generally says that after a certain amount of time, these things become public domain, you have certain companies like Disney that exploit that in such a way that they are able to maintain hold of these iconic characters like Mickey Mouse, because they make a shitload of money off that, and they don't want to abide by these laws, because effectively they'd lose the goose that laid the golden egg in that situation. So with Scott, it isn't like he could be the person to direct the next film. But at the same time, he might not be next in line, but it could be the next person in line after that, or they could try someone else, and it's not necessarily going to happen right away. It just doesn't. The Alien franchise isn't like that. It's very there isn't quite the same demand. But it's profitable in the long haul for Fox. So I'm curious to see. There's just so many different variables in place here, but I don't think that they'll stop making Alien films. Okay, because you have movies like Alien Resurrection or AVP, which are really bad, or Alien Requiem, which was super shitty, right? But you still had Prometheus get made, and you still had Alien Covenant get made, and those are fine films. If you just look at them by themselves, or you look at them within the franchise, even no matter how you slice it, they're still better than the worst entries in the franchise. So if Fox is going to continue making movies after Alien Requiem, and they're going to hire Scott to do it, then I don't really consider us having anything to worry about in regards to how Covenant performed at the box office. I mean, less and less people are going to the box office anyways, or to theaters nowadays anyways, just because of the way that movies are distributed. It's a lot easier to access things online, to access digital content, to get things for free. That's a problem. But the industry still exists, and it will exist in some shape or form until it changes. And that's just the nature of technology. But it doesn't mean that they'll stop making Alien films, necessarily. I'm not saying that they'll make them forever, but I'm hopeful at this point that we're going to get another Alien film. I'm hoping it's by Scott because I like Prometheus, I liked Covenant, I liked Alien. I like his movies, I like his science fiction films, The Martian, Blade Runner, even something like Legend, which is straight fantasy. There are things about it that I really enjoy. Even the theatrical cut versus the director's cut. I like both for different reasons. But I'm a huge nerd, so I like Tangerine Dream. But I also like Jerry Goldsmith, so I'm not bothered by the different composers, which each version of that, the European versus the American. And I'm very open-minded about this kind of thing. And again, I've been watching Covenant a lot lately. It used to be Alien, right? I went through a phase where I was watching Aliens every day. I loved it. I wore the VHS tape for that out. I watched it so many times. But I'm still watching those movies, and I like them. And if Fox decides to make another film in the franchise, hey, great. And I know that they'll probably never be purchased by Disney because it's an R-rated franchise. It's always been an R-rated franchise with the exception of AVP, I believe, which was PG-13, but virtually every other entry in the franchise is R-rated. And Disney, despite the fact that they freaking buy everything out there, constantly shy away from R-rated material as far as I can tell. You had the Black Cauldron, which is PG, which is a box office failure. But then you have certain entries like some of the Star Wars films, which I believe are PG-13. Rogue One may have been PG-13. I'm fairly certain was PG-13, but not R-rated. A pretty serious kind of war film, but still not R-rated. But Alien, by and large, is an R-rated franchise, and they've always kept it that way. And Scott's certainly not someone who's afraid to do an R-rated picture, even though I will say that I always thought Prometheus was kind of close to PG-13 territory in regards to the lack of nudity, the lack of swearing overall, and just apart from one or two scenes, wasn't really R-rated. But Alien Covenant was, so, and that made me happy. I like R-rated films, but it's also very symbolic and all that. So it's just something that, as I move forward with my life and I continue to appreciate the franchise for what it is, I'll be keeping close tabs on these films as they hopefully continue to get made in some shape or form. And if Scott doesn't make another film, I like Alien Covenant. Though I will say that I want a director's cut. A director's cut would be nice. It would be nice to get just a longer version of the film, not because it would assist the film in any shape or form. Though I will say that generally speaking, if you're going for suspense, the Hitchcockian sort of approach to drama, it's a good idea to make your scenes longer, to have longer takes. But of course, Scott wasn't interested in that, and symbolically the film works. You don't necessarily have to have a Hitchcockian approach if you want to go for symbolism. Obviously, 2001: A Space Odyssey is sort of an exception to that, where it's a very symbolic-heavy film, especially towards the end of the film. But throughout, by and large, there's a lot of symbolic sort of stuff going on, and yet it's very Hitchcockian. There are very long scenes where not a lot's happening. You're just kind of sitting there. You're almost bored. You have the potential to be bored if you're not interested in that type of situation. But you also have the potential to be bored if you're not interested in symbolism. And I've heard people say that Alien is a stupid film. I've heard people say that Alien Covenant is a stupid film too. So there you go. But I'll always like the franchise. I'll be watching these films when I'm an old man. And Ridley Scott's son, Tony Scott, is an old man. And he's directing movies, or his son is directing Alien films. Because you keep having these instances where Tony Scott does viral material, but I think he only has one film to his name. Lucy, I think? Never saw it, but his science fiction sort of debut. But apart from that, he did the viral for Prometheus, and he did some of the material, The Last Supper, for Alien Covenant. And it's good stuff, I like to see him in a film because it felt a lot different than Scott's. The work of the son felt different than the father. Just like Wayland and David, they're different despite being cut from the same cloth, as it were. But as far as the director's cut goes with Alien Covenant, having watched the film a number of times, there are moments where I feel like a scene was longer, and I could see them kind of cutting, sort of in the middle, like an intermediate sort of cut. And it's like, I really, really would like to see the full version. And you hear that 15 or 20 minutes were cut from the scene. How much of this is actually what we saw as far as extended scenes or deleted scenes? And there's some viral content that's just really solid, and just different things that you could kind of incorporate into the film and make it interesting with like a fan edit or something like that. And of course, nowadays people can do that relatively easy. I did that with Prometheus and had a great deal of fun with it. But I'd like to see something official. And it's not something that we got with Prometheus, and that was a film that I felt could have benefited from just having certain scenes that were a little bit longer. But I will say that Covenant is a bit more coherent than Prometheus. There's a lot more confusing shit in Prometheus than there was in Covenant. In Covenant, if you look at things under the microscope, you can by and large find explanations for just about everything. Whereas with Prometheus, there were just certain things that didn't make any sense. Like the guards that guard Wayland just disappear. They don't get killed. They're on the ship when Yannick flies it into the Juggernaut, and yet they just sort of disappear. The movie forgets about them. And it's a little confusing. You could treat them like stormtroopers, I guess, but and they don't show all the faces of the stormtroopers in Star Wars when they blow up the Death Star, right? They have the face of the main villain. What was his name? Grand Moff Tarkin, I believe, and he was played by Peter Cushing. They show his face, and they show maybe the face of a couple other stormtroopers, maybe, but they don't show everyone. And it's the same idea with that film, Prometheus. It's the Death Star type of approach to red shirts, where they just kind of die off screen and they're not really mentioned because they're not an important part to the story. But it's still confusing. It just doesn't make any mention of them whatsoever. You're conducting a mutiny where you have a large portion of the crew is still on board the ship, and they just die, and they're not mentioned. And these are faces too. These aren't stormtroopers wearing helmets. These are dudes with faces that you remember. You're like, hey, what happened to that guy or that guy? It's not like, oh, well, stormtroopers, okay, they die. But with these guys on board the Prometheus, they literally just disappear. And but with the director's cut, they could have had a scene where they get locked up or they get killed during the attack or something, but it felt incomplete. Whereas Covenant felt complete, but they felt like they had really trimmed the fat, almost to the point that it's confusing. But if you study the film, there's a lot there. But I still would like a director's cut, mainly for aesthetic reasons. That's the reason I wanted the director's cut. I'm like, I love Alien. I love those long takes. And it's not necessary for Covenant, but there's so much shit that happens in that movie. But it flies by at a lightning quick sort of speed. It's almost kaleidoscopic in nature. It's this montage that plays at twice the speed it normally would. It's like, give us a movie that's 2.5 hours long, or 2 hours and 45 minutes long, like the director's cut for Aliens. 40 miles of bad road, as James Cameron said. I would happily welcome something like that for Alien Covenant, because it's not gonna change the theatrical cut. It's the same idea with the director's cut for Alien. You still have the theatrical cut of that film. Though, to be completely honest, if you try and find the theatrical cut for Aliens, I've heard people say that it's actually kind of tricky to find that nowadays. A lot of times, all that's available or readily available is the director's cut of Aliens. Though, of course, back in 2003, 2004, when they had the Alien quadrilogy, you had the theatrical cut for Alien and the director's cut, and the same for Aliens. So, and I think you had the assembly cut for Alien 3. I'm not 100% sure about that, because I never watched it, and I never, with Alien Resurrection, they only had the theatrical cut. But if they did a director's cut, then that would be kind of cool. And then, of course, you have classic films like The Wild Bunch or Seven Samurai, the Criterion Collection, where you have certain versions that were kind of compiled after the original director's death. With Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, they trimmed a lot of footage from that movie, and then I watched I don't want to say it was the Criterion Collection, but it was like a version that was put together after Sam Peckinpah died. Okay, but they introduced a lot of scenes that were cut from the theatrical version that actually make the movie a lot better. And the kind of idea that, and then you had the final cut by Scott, right, where you had all of these changes. And that movie had various cuts throughout the years. You had the director's cut, which was something that was different from the theatrical cut. But then you had the final cut by Scott, where everything was remastered, and they took certain things and left them in, or took them out, and but they very easily could do something like that with Alien, even if Scott isn't on board. Because again, Scott could just up and die, and then whoever sort of inherits the rights to that, maybe Luke Scott, he might do a Christopher Tolkien kind of thing, where you have people that want to fiddle around with all that. Christopher Tolkien's like, look, no, you can have that because he sold the movie rights to it, but you can't have the Silmarillion. But with Scott, it's interesting to see, when Scott dies, perhaps his son will be a little bit more open-minded towards the idea of a director's cut. And there's no way to really say for sure what's going to happen with that. But I welcome the idea, because I would watch it, because I've seen Alien Covenant probably 8 times now, give or take. And I watch it a lot. I like it, it's just every time I watch it, I notice something new. I could easily do another commentary track for the film, and it would just be like, hey, this is something new that I noticed. Each and every time I watch the film, I notice something different. And it's great. But I would happily watch a director's cut of that. Just like if they had another cut of Alien, I'd watch it. I remember having work prints of Alien that I used to buy and watch, where people took work print footage and put it into the film to make it longer. And a lot of it was just sort of rough. It's like the assembly cut with Alien 3. But it's interesting. I'm not saying that it always is to the film's benefit, but I'd watch it, So we'll see how that... who knows what the future may bring in regards to a sequel, in regards to director's cut. But there will always be Alien films as long as Fox continues to make movies. And I don't know if they're in trouble like some studios are, because you have the film studio that made Masters of the Universe, for instance, went bankrupt. Or you have the film studio for what's another one? The Terminator. You had Orion Pictures. I don't think they're around anymore. Or TriStar Pictures. Studios do go bankrupt, or they close their doors. But Fox has been around a long time, and as long as they continue to make films, I would bet my bottom dollar or top dollar, I would bet the mortgage that they would continue to make Alien movies, because Alien movies ultimately make them money. They may not make them as much money as, say, Avatar or Titanic or something like that, or the Marvel films or Disney, the way that they monopolize. But they'll continue to in the future. As far as director's cuts, who knows? Is Scott going to be around forever? No. But will he continue to make films? I hope so, because I love Scott films. I can't wait to watch the next Scott film. I mean, even if it was something like a historical drama, I'd watch it. Just because it looks so good. And so that kind of concludes this rant. I feel like originally I just wanted to talk about the symbolism in Covenant, but I also talked about just the financial outlook of the series, potential sequels, and director's cuts and things like that, the future of the franchise. And there's a lot of different aspects to that. And then, of course, Luke Scott, Ridley Scott's son, is he going to continue in his father's footsteps? Is he going to get to make an Alien film? It would be interesting to see what he produces. So I didn't really set off to talk about all this stuff, but this is kind of a rant sort of video, and yeah, just a lot of stuff to talk about. If you like the video, like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned. I don't get on a plane for another week yet. I probably will do another video or two on Covenant in regards to just little things that I'm noticing in the film. I probably will do another commentary track just because there's so much shit that's leaping out at me now. I feel like I almost should do a list, but if I tried to list everything that leaps out at me, it'd be impossible to do it in a single setting. I'd almost have to pause the film every so often just to say, hey, look at this, look at that, because the scenes are so rich. And that's why I continue to watch the film. In any case, guys, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more videos. And very shortly, I'll be in the UK, where hopefully I can continue to do this sort of thing. We'll see. Until then, take care.